Genesis chapter 6, verse 12. We're continuing the introduction to the flood narrative, and so let's dig in. Ke Aden Kyrios Hatheos Tein Gain, Ke Ain Katef Thermene, Hati Katef Therin Pasasarks Tein Hadan Altu Epi Tes Geis. We'll notice that the Kai here is continuing the prior narrative, and we see the first verb here is Aden, and that is an aorist of horao, third singular aorist active indicative. So this is a verb for to see, of course, and the subject is Kyrios Hatheos. What's interesting about this is that he is seeing the earth or the land, as you see there. And if you go all the way back to Genesis 1, verse 10 and following, you see the same use of Aden, you see the same use of gain multiple times, but also with the light and with the animals and so forth. God has observed his creation back in Genesis 1 and seen that it was good. Now he is going to see that it is bad, as we'll see. So a really interesting contrast there with Genesis. Although I've introduced that previously in the flood narrative, so much of this is going back to the original creation account, because we're going to see this widespread judgment on creation and, in a sense, a kind of new birth. I also mentioned that the Masoretic just has Elohim here as opposed to Lord God. And I find that to be interesting because, as we've seen numerous times in Genesis, sometimes the Masoretic will have the Tetragrammaton, and the Genesis translator into Greek will add a Hotheos. In this situation, it's the opposite. The Masoretic, assuming this represents closely whatever the Hebrew was in front of the translator, has just God, but they've added Kyrios. So really interesting phenomena when it comes to the divine names. So he saw the earth, and what is the problem? Ain Katef Tharmene. Now, I love this formula in Greek, and I enjoy teaching it to my willing students in Greek too. This is a periphrastic construction where you have a form of a me here. This, of course, is the imperfect third singular. It doesn't have to be a me, but typically is, followed by a participle. So this form of kataphthero is the nominative singular feminine. It's the perfect passive participle with the mene ending there. And you know it's a perfect because it actually does have a kind of fake reduplication here. It's supposed to be kata, but you have an epsilon there. You don't reduplicate the th. But anyhow, this periphrastic construction is a combination of an me plus a participle. And so it's something like it was, and then what's the meaning of the verb? Katathero means something like ruin or devastate. This is just an excerpt from Myriaca, and I've introduced that lexicon before. And this is, in a sense, perhaps a more intense form than what we saw in the prior verse. We actually saw the unaugmented form, the uncompound form, the thero there, which does mean to destroy or corrupt. Here, this is maybe perhaps a more strong form. The earth was devastated. It was ruined completely in some sense. And in fact, you'll see Myriaca is pointing ahead to Genesis 6:13 with this verb as well. But hold that thought. Now, why was it devastated? Now, this I find to be really interesting, the explanation. You have an explanatory hati here because then we have the same verb being repeated, only this time it's a third singular aorist active indicative. Because all flesh has ruined it. So the earth was ruined or has been ruined or corrupted or destroyed because all flesh has ruined it. And more specifically, Tein Hadan Altu. So every single human, I suppose with Noah as the main exception, of course, has ruined his path or his way of life upon the earth. And I find this to be so fascinating because in the next verse, as already sort of anticipated, we're going to see this same verb in 6:13, where God is going to speak to Noah and say, I'm going to kataphthero the earth. But what's interesting is that verse 12 explains that in a certain sense, God is bringing the judgment upon the earth that it has already done to itself through humanity's sin, all flesh's sin. Flesh has destroyed it. Therefore, the earth itself has been destroyed or ruined. And then in 6:13, as we'll see, God is going to in turn bring a widespread judgment on it. So this really fourfold use, if you also keep in mind the prior use of just thero in the prior verse, emphasizes that God is going to give over creation to the sin that it has already fallen into, if you will. This corruption becomes its own self-judgment, if you will. So I find it to be really, really fascinating in terms of how this word plays out from Genesis 6:11 now in 12, and then it's going to carry forward in Genesis 6:13. So fun stuff, but also just really love bare fascia constructions. Hope you enjoyed this video.